It's a man in his 20s shot in the torso. Organized anarchists. Police are not present. Everywhere you look, honestly, it looks like a war zone.
Don't go outside alone. Don't trust anyone ever. Except for the government. You can always trust them. Anyway, though. Watch out for murderers, kidnappers, carjackers, viral diseases. Be very afraid. Okay. Enough of that nonsense. This is starting to be way too much. It seems like everything we're hearing these days is just telling us to be afraid of something. And even if we're not like watching the news or watching some source that's telling us directly to be afraid, we're just becoming very distrustful of the world around us and just afraid of pretty much everything that moves. Why don't we trust anything anymore? Has the world really changed that much for the worse, or have we changed somehow? I think we all have a case of mean world syndrome. Okay, so what's this mean world syndrome about? I hadn't heard of it until recently. I stumbled across it the other day when I was doing some research. Mean world syndrome is a cognitive bias where someone thinks that the world is much more dangerous than it actually is. It's where someone's way of thinking is skewed, so that they view everything as much more dangerous than it really is. The term was coined by George Gerbner, a US communications professor. In the late 1960s and 1970s, he led many studies looking at the effects of violent media on viewers, and especially he looked at television. Gerbner categorized people into three groups: the light viewers, medium viewers, and heavy viewers. Light viewers watch television for less than 2 hours a day, medium viewers watch television for 2 to 4 hours a day, and heavy viewers watch it for more than 4 hours a day. Gerbner found that the group classified as heavy users were much more shy, depressed, and lonely than the other groups. He also found a direct correlation between how much television someone watched and how much they feared being victimized on a daily basis. The more television they watched, the less they trusted others. He said that the consequence of heavy viewing of television was the normalization of violent behavior. Since the 1970s, there's been many other studies that have confirmed the same thing. More viewing of violent media increases stress, it increases depression, it increases post-traumatic stress, increases substance use, it increases loneliness, fear, anxiety, all of it. If all this research from 50 years ago concluded that about television, how much more would it affect us today when we have every kind of media imaginable on demand 24/7, much of it violent? In 2009, the American Academy of Pediatrics released a statement that concluded that media violence contributed to the fear of being harmed. So we see this everywhere. Consuming more violent content makes you more scared of being harmed. We've now been consuming content like this for decades, and it's only getting more and more violent. And to many of us, the idea of something dangerous happening, of getting mugged, of going outside and getting robbed, is not that uncommon of a thought. So all this begs the question, are these fears valid? Is the world really as dangerous as we've conditioned ourselves to think that it is?
So now we challenge the idea that the world is a more dangerous place now than ever. I've heard it many times by the elderly, by my parents, and by many others, that back in the day you could keep your doors unlocked and you'd be totally safe. What exactly changed that perception? Was it even true in the first place? I don't personally believe the world is an inherently unsafe, lethal place to be due to other evil humans. All we know of the evil in the world generally boils down to the stories we hear, the media we consume, and the experiences we experience. All of which can warp our perception on social reality, as defined by Gerbner. All of this can be nuanced, and it definitely also depends on the part of the world that you live in also.
In 2014, BBC News released an article that said that childhood is safer now than it was in the 1970s. According to them, it's significantly less likely now for a teenager to be a victim of violent crime than it was in 1975. And overall, the chance of a teenager being a victim of violence or coming to a violent death is much lower than it was in the 1970s. They even say that the death rate of young people is about a third of it was in the 70s. According to an article by the Pew Research Center, both FBI and Bureau of Justice data show that rates of violent crime and property crime have significantly decreased since the 1990s. In the 1990s, crime had significantly spiked, and it's much lower now than it was then. If you expand the graph back a few years, you can see there's a little bit more to the story, as crime had spiked a bit in the 80s and 90s. But for many of us, this was when our parents learned what the world was like, when crime rates were much higher than they are now. So then, us being raised by them were being taught that the world was a dangerous place, and maybe it's not quite as dangerous as it was. And maybe it wasn't actually as dangerous as they thought it was then. If you ask them, they probably weren't super scared of it growing up. All this being said, I will say, there's still some areas of some big cities that I don't want to walk around in, especially, alone at night. Like, no, I'm not stupid. Crime is still a thing. It's out there. I'm maybe going to still make some smart decisions, but I'm not going to be worried about it 24/7. That being said, consider the violent death rates in Western Europe over the last few centuries. I don't know what was going on with Italy in some of the years, but as you can see, we're safer now than we've ever been. So why are we more afraid than we've ever been?
It's vitally important to understand the world that we live in. and to understand what's happening in politics, on the streets, and in the economy of the country that you live in. Obviously, right? I'm definitely not saying that the world is a safe utopia either, don't get me wrong. Our shared experiences determine that we need to keep a common sense head on our shoulders. But most news is biased. Most news agencies have agendas, and most news agencies primarily care about getting your eyes on their headline. Bad news sells, and we happily feed it to ourselves on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, YouTube, on top of any other major news outlet. How often do we expose ourselves to any number of these every single day? It started with simple television in the 40s with just a few channels. The first public television broadcast took place in 1936 in London, England. It was transmitted by the BBC featuring a speech by the British King.
In Glasgow.
Broadcasting began in the United States by 1939, the first station being WNBC in New York. The channels grew, as did the news agencies. By the 90s, CNN was the first to make news a 24/7 report for both big and small news, as opposed to scheduled programming. The Gulf War proved how CNN had changed the world. US military leaders chose their words carefully during televised press briefings, knowing that Saddam Hussein was watching CNN too. Fast forward a couple decades, and we're split on CNN, Fox News, and a wide variety of news sources, all reporting on the uncertain time of COVID. The amount of different information that was being told from multiple news sources during this time was absurd. Political agendas showed through more during this period than I could ever remember in my lifetime. The legitimacy of the vaccines, mask wearing, social distancing, business operations, ivermectin, and COVID itself, and the origin of COVID were all questioned, and were all answered differently based off of the news outlet that you watched. Your perception was literally warped around the media you consumed during this period. Whatever political side you were on, you watched the news that fit the ideas around what you should think. Your perception literally warped around the media you consumed during this period. It was deadly. It is deadly, and an extremely disagreeable period in the United States. But as these things happen, time usually reveals more of the truth after the storm settles, generally. I have a lot more respect for independent journalism who documents world events as they are. There's little to no agenda with simply showing what's happening while on the street amongst the chaos.
Right now, New York City is experiencing record homelessness. And lately, both private developers and the city have been building all...
Do yourself a favor. If you absolutely can't remove yourself from these social media platforms, or at the very least limit yourself, heavily limit the news that you receive on them. There's a healthy balance between being uninformed and living in unnecessary fear. Unfollow accounts, Reddit threads, hashtags, whatever it takes, as these are usually just rage bait anyways. In my opinion, Twitter is the worst culprit of them all. Platforms like this hunk of garbage, the town square, is where people get recreationally mad and whiny. You will be sucked into radical and emotional viewpoints. And it's a waste of time that, if you think about it, provides you with absolutely zero value. You will change no lives, you will change no perspectives by arguing with someone on Reddit. Absolutely zero. Value your time and go learn a new skill in life. That's not doom scrolling. Stay informed, but watch the world through your own eyes. And while you're at it, do something good for the world. Stay safe.